In the biggest move of the trade deadline so far, the Pelicans have acquired CJ McCollum. There's a ton to talk about here. Let's go ahead and get into it. So the trade is Portland acquiring Josh Hart, Thomas Satoransky, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Didi Lozada, a 2022 first-round pick that is protected, and 2 future second-round picks, whereas the Pelicans are getting CJ McCollum, Larry Nance, and Tony Snell. There's a ton of really interesting stuff to talk about here, but I want to begin with this. Portland is finally making the move that everybody has said that they've needed to for really 2 to 3 years at this point. It seemed like this was finally going to be the year that they were going to split up Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum one way or another, whether it be CJ for Ben Simmons, whether it be Damian Lillard for Ben Simmons. A variety of different moves were on the table for this group. And once they made that trade a couple of days ago, where they basically just dumped the salaries of Robert Covington and Norman Powell on the Clippers, it became clear that this is a team that finally recognized the situation that they were in, that their ceiling was not on the level of what they would hope that it would be with Damian Lillard there, and they needed to split up Dame and CJ. Even though that trade was an example of very poor asset movement, where they go from having Gary Trent to moving him for Norman Powell and what they used to get Robert Covington and then basically just dumping those 2 guys for nothing, it did signal this team's desire and willingness to start to reset this roster just a little bit. And that's certainly the case with this McCollum trade as well. So before we get into really the trade itself, I want to give them props for at least recognizing what everybody else has for a little while now, and that is they needed to change something up. Now, I'm going to circle back to Portland later on in the video, but I want to talk about what this deal means for New Orleans, because I think a lot of people's reactions to this initially are positive because they don't feel like the value that Portland got in exchange for CJ McCollum is really all that much. It doesn't seem like New Orleans is really giving up a ton, but I have a real significant issue with this move for New Orleans. I understand the mindset of, we need to be a good basketball team. We need some positive momentum. A playoff appearance would do wonders for this group. It's a young team. Brandon Ingram is just on an island out here. Jonas Valanciunas is a veteran. He's trying. He's putting in a ton of effort to make this a good team. And after a really tough start to the year, they've turned it around lately. Of course, they're still waiting on Zion to come back as well. And so there's upside to acquiring a proven veteran scorer in CJ McCollum to really raise the ceiling of your group. Here's my problem, though. Does everybody remember when Detroit was kind of in the middle? They were kind of stuck. Van Gundy was there. It was clear that he was going to get fired soon. He was in charge of personnel, and he made the Blake Griffin trade. And we all kind of looked around like, this is a weird acquisition to bring in Blake and try and have him fit with that roster. But it was clear what was happening. Van Gundy was trying to save his job. He didn't care about the future of the franchise. He didn't care about the position that was going to put Detroit in moving forward if the move didn't work. He just looked at it and said, if it works, we're a playoff team and I save my job. If it doesn't, I'm going to get fired anyway, so it doesn't matter what we do with our future assets. And that's the situation that I feel like David Griffin is in with New Orleans, where he looks at his situation and realizes, yes, we've got some future assets. We've got interesting young players. We've got all these future picks, but that's not going to be enough to save my job. And someone else is going to get to do all the fun stuff with all these future picks and stuff if I don't make a move and I don't get this team to the postseason this year. He recognized the opportunity that he had to do that, and that's what this move feels like. It feels like, especially given the draft pick compensation involved in this trade, that David Griffin's not thinking about the long-term future of the Pelicans. He's only thinking about how best to save his job, and 90% of the time, when that's the logic behind a trade, it goes poorly in the immediate or the long-term sense. And that's no disrespect to CJ McCollum, Larry Nance. Those guys are going to help New Orleans a ton, and in a play-in race for the playoffs that's pretty wide open, and one that New Orleans can certainly involve themselves in and probably make the play-in game this year after making this move for CJ McCollum, assuming that he's healthy. I'm not denying that. And honestly, if the draft pick compensation was different, my opinion on that would be wildly different, because they aren't giving up a ton for a player in CJ McCollum that is the talent level that he is, contract not included there. So like, Josh Hart is an interesting young player. He signed for the next couple of seasons, but he's not like a game changer for your group. Satoransky's an expiring. Nickeil Alexander-Walker has some potential, but is not necessarily someone that I'm incredibly excited about. And then the 2 future seconds. But here's the problem. New Orleans is not going to have their first round pick in 2022 unless they completely bottom out and they end up in the 1 through 4 range. That's the only scenario in which they keep their pick this year. And when I initially saw the details of this trade, where it said they're discussing a trade which Josh Hart and draft compensation, I was like, okay, they're going to use some of these Milwaukee picks or pick swaps, or Lakers picks or pick swaps. They're going to keep their own pick just in case something goes poorly this year, someone gets hurt, things like that. And then I'm okay with that move. But the fact that it's their own pick makes me very, very nervous about what this could mean for New Orleans. Now, on the basketball court, CJ McCollum is going to be very, very helpful for this group. He's going to be a scorer that allows Brandon Ingram to be off the ball a little bit more, to not have him have to do everything. He's going to be what they were kind of hoping that Kyle Lowry was going to be when they tried to make that move, and then they ultimately settled on Devontae Graham. A perimeter playmaker scorer type is exactly what this group needs, and they're probably a playoff team now, and that's a huge step in the right direction. And if Zion comes back and is fully healthy, maybe they're a scary playoff team. He's going to be on the roster for the next couple of seasons. But here's my issue. I don't like the contract and the age of CJ McCollum as it relates to this Pelicans roster. It really feels like it locks them in terms of their flexibility. They're really limited now in terms of what roster moves they can make until McCollum's deal goes through a couple of more seasons. However, the thing that, of course, looms over all of this is the possibility of Zion Williamson being unhappy in New Orleans and or requesting a trade and or leaving as a free agent in a few seasons. It's kind of incredible that that is still a conversation we can have about Zion, despite the fact that we have not seen him on a basketball court all season long, but the threat of him leaving is very, very real. As of this moment, I think it's unlikely that he would leave a ton of guaranteed money on the table to become an unrestricted free agent early, as we've discussed in the past. But this is the Pelicans we're talking about. This is not the Knicks. This is not the Lakers. This is not a premier franchise in the league. And when you have a player like Zion, who's already shown to be at least slightly unhappy with his situation, that's the caliber of player that he is, that's going to have as much interest as teams are going to have in him, regardless of his health status moving forward, sometimes you do have to make moves that sacrifice the long term of the group in order to make sure that those players are happy in an immediate sense so that they stick around. We've seen this time and time again with teams like Milwaukee, where they made the Drew Holiday trade last offseason, or various different versions of Cavaliers and Heat and Lakers teams that have sacrificed long-term assets to make sure that LeBron would ultimately be happy, and they paid for it once he left. That's the unfortunate situation that New Orleans finds themselves in as a smaller market team with a legitimate superstar caliber player on their roster that, even though he isn't fully healthy, is constantly putting pressure on this team to put a positive product on the floor and make sure that he's happy. Now, circling back to Portland, there's two different ways you can read this. One is this, in combination with the Powell and the Covington moves, is this group is blowing it up. They're trying to create some flexibility, get some future assets, and eventually it's going to lead to a Damian Lillard trade, because clearly there's no way he's planning on playing the rest of the year, given what this roster is going to look like the rest of the way. And it's a future move that involves a Damian Lillard trade down the road, and they're going to try and follow this like Thunder and Pelicans model of just breaking everything down, getting as many assets as you can, and resetting it. Or you're trying to create a situation similar to what Washington did when they traded Westbrook. They tried to create a situation around Beal that would look promising into the future, where you create some space, you create some flexibility, you get some assets, and you go from there. And Portland has already come out and said that basically their plan is we're building around Damian Lillard here. We understand that the age is going to be an issue, and there's been some injury issues lately for him, but they're still committed to him. He's still committed to them. And this is still a positive future outlook for Portland. And in that context, I kind of love this trade for Portland. I know a lot of people don't think that this was enough for CJ McCollum, but if they end up with, for example, the ninth pick in this draft, and you've got these young guys, and you get out of a ton of salary, that feels like a really positive outcome in exchange for CJ McCollum in a draft that's going to have some really good prospects within that top 10. Now, that is assuming that New Orleans doesn't make the playoffs, and then maybe you get some good bounces in the lottery. But regardless, if you end up with a top 14 pick out of this trade in exchange for CJ McCollum, in addition to the contract savings, I think that's a huge win for Portland. And if they really do plan on building around Dame moving forward, using that flexibility and using those assets, I think that's a much more exciting possibility than whatever they were facing had they kept McCollum, Powell, and Covington on the roster past this Thursday's trade deadline. And so at the end of the day, this is going to be a trade that a couple of years from now, we're going to look back on and think that it was a pretty groundbreaking move potentially. Maybe New Orleans really, turned around and saved their franchise over the next couple of seasons because they have the legitimacy of CJ McCollum there, and Zion comes back, and Brandon Ingram's there, and they've got this nice little nucleus, and they added the lead guard that they've been wanting to for forever in CJ McCollum, and their perennial playoff team. And then you have the ceiling of Zion. He decides to stay. David Griffin keeps his job, and everything's going positively. Or the McCollum thing doesn't work. It really limits their flexibility contract-wise moving forward. Maybe Zion does end up leaving, or you're forced to trade him and or Ingram, and the team is in a completely different city a couple years from now. Whereas for Portland, they get all this flexibility, and maybe they can't do anything with it. Ultimately, it leads to Dame leaving, or they waited too long to move Dame and or CJ, and they're in a situation that is certainly not enviable, by any other team in the league. There's a ton of different possibilities from this trade. I don't really think you can call either team a huge winner or a huge loser because it really depends on what this draft pick ends up at and how positively CJ McCollum impacts the Pelicans.